Usually in part 3 of the speaking test, you will be asked to talk about the future in at least one of the questions. Some of the questions in part 1 may also be about the future. Will and going to are popular words to do this, so we'll look at them, but there are some other ways to do it too. It's important to notice when a question is about the future, so you can make sure that your response is also using the future tense. So let's look at will and going to and the explanations for these and how to use them. Let's look at will first. So there are various uses of will, but in IELTS part 3 we can use it when we want to talk about future events that we believe are certain. Will is followed by verb 1 or the infinitive. So here's an example. Education will be more important in the future because as populations increase, there will be greater competition for jobs. If you use will on its own, this means you believe in what you are saying 100%, or you have 100% evidence to back up your claim. You can add in a word like definitely, as well if you want to emphasize your certainty even more. So for example, education will definitely be more important in the future because as populations increase, there will be greater competition for jobs. If you are less certain, which is often the case as we usually don't have evidence with us, then we use words such as maybe, perhaps, possibly, probably, and likely. So let's look at another example. So education will probably be more important in the future because as populations increase, there will be greater competition for jobs. Now let's look at going to for the future. So will and going to are used in similar ways. We can use going to talk about a plan we have, but in the IELTS test part 3 we use it when we are making a prediction based on evidence we know of, often from what we can see in front of us. Going to is followed by verb 1 or the infinitive again. The sky is very black. That's the evidence we can see. I think it's going to rain. That's not an IELTS example, but it just shows you how it can be used based on evidence. The internet is getting much easier to use and safer, so I think it's going to be very popular for buying clothes in the future. The climate is going to become warmer and warmer because the government is not doing enough to prevent global warming. So should you use will or going to? Will is more common for giving predictions about future events. So if you're unsure of the difference between them, just use will. However, we often use will and going to interchangeably. For example, in the sentences above that we looked at, we can swap them without affecting the meaning. The climate will or is going to become warmer and warmer because the government is not doing enough to prevent global warming. Or education will probably or is going to be more important in the future because as populations increase, there will be greater competition for jobs. So what other ways are there for talking about the future in the IELTS test? We can also use modal verbs. So in addition to will and going to, another way to talk about the future is to use modal verbs such as may and might. Again, these are used when you're not certain about something. They have the same meaning. I think education may become more important in the future, but it really depends on what happens to the job market. Or the climate might get cooler in the future if we manage to restrict CO2 emissions. We can also use the present continuous to talk about the future in IELTS. It is often used when we want to talk about what has been arranged for the future. So it may be less common for part 3 and more common in part 1, but it's still possible for some things you may want to say. Our president is meeting the president of the USA next year, so hopefully they will discuss the problems of our country. So let's look at some samples of will and going to and how they're used to answer some IELTS questions. So this is a sample question. How do you think the internet will change people's buying habits in the future? Let's look at a possible answer. We won't go through everything. You can pause the video if you want to look at it. But it's saying buying from the internet has become more and more popular. Give some examples. You can see how it's used further on. So I think this will only increase in the future as more people feel safe to buy online and online shops make it easier to purchase this way. I also think our lives are only going to become busier, so more people will choose to shop this way. So let's look at some more examples of how questions can actually be worded so you know you're being asked about the future. So you have to spot these questions. So do you think any new national celebrations will come into being in the future? So you'd obviously need to use your future in your answer. How do you think the internet will change people's buying habits in the future? Another example, do you think it will be more or less important to have a good education in the future? So listen carefully for the examiner using words like that in the questions, and then you'll know you'll need to use will or going to in your answers somewhere. Okay, there's a link below this video so you can read that lesson online if you like, and also go to IELTS Buddy for more lessons and ebooks and more materials to train you for IELTS.